deep historical alliance with Big Pharma and the public health agencies. The disturbing story that unfolds here has never been told, and many in power have worked hard to prevent the public from learning it. The principal character is Anthony Fauci.
Today, I will be your Master of Ceremonies for Event 201. Today's scenario is going to simulate meetings of a multi-stakeholder group called the Pandemic Emergency Board. This board has been urgently convened by the World Economic Forum.
In October of 2019, you have a tabletop simulation that is sponsored by who? The funder is the Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, Johns Hopkins School for Security, which is funded by NIH and Gates. The major hosts include not only Gates, but also Avril Haines, who's the former deputy director of the CIA. So what is the CIA doing hosting a simulation on public health? The CIA is not a public health agency. It is an intelligence agency. It does not do public health.
The line between disinformation and misinformation is not always an easy one to find. That we shouldn't be trying to control communication, but rather flood the zone. I certainly seen the value of communicating constantly on these issues so as to continue to deal with, sort of the vacuum that can be created in this circumstance. All of the disinformation that will be put out, it's going to be important to actually have a response to those questions. There are also intelligence sources identifying multiple foreign disinformation campaigns.
Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or for the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
It can happen quickly. A Marshall-type plan, don't mean to say that exactly, but a Marshall plan that can go into effect can stimulate a change very quickly.
The distrust relates to the health system more generally.
A step up from the part of the government on enforcement actions against fake news.
I think a couple of things we have to consider are, even before this began, the anti-vaccine movement was very strong. And this is something specifically through social media that spread. So as we move forward, obviously trust in pharmaceuticals and government is very important at this moment.
The simulation is a simulation of a coronavirus that has escaped and ends up killing 60 million people around the planet. The Chinese government knew of the escape of the virus by September 12th, 2019. Curiously, who is there is George Gao, who was the head of the Chinese CDC. At that time, George Gao almost certainly knew the coronavirus was circulating.
Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia. The sickest required intensive care. Many died. It's spreading rapidly throughout local communities. International travel has turned local epidemics into a pandemic spanning the globe.
There are now more than 30,000 reported cases. Experts warn this may be just the beginning of a global problem.
More than half of the recognized cases have required hospital care, creating a huge strain on healthcare systems. The fatality rate is about 10%. Because it appears the virus is readily transmitted through the air from person to person, essentially all people are susceptible. Experts agree unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere. 2 to 4 times more lethal than the 1918 influenza pandemic, the worst pandemic on record. Even so, some people only exhibit mild flu-like symptoms, not requiring treatment in a hospital. Alarmingly, those people are able to walk around and spread the virus, not realizing they are doing so. Even worse, international travelers have been arriving at their destinations symptom-free, but within a matter of hours, becoming ill. Travel-related cases have blossomed into outbreaks in a number of locations and have quickly likely grown faster than health authorities could respond and contain them.
I'm joined by immunologist Dr. Yvonne Bello and Dr. Rhea Blakey, an epidemiologist, both highly respected in their fields.
Researchers are working on a vaccine. Even if we discover a good vaccine candidate, we are starting from scratch, and it takes time to test safety and efficacy, typically years.
We simply cannot rely on these old timelines and processes. With enough money and political will, anything is possible.
Our U.S. affiliate has just released polling results on public expectations for a vaccine. The majority of Americans expect a vaccine to be available within 2 months, and 65% of those polled are eager to take the vaccine, even if it's experimental. In related news, a significant demand for personal protective equipment like N95 masks and gloves are on the rise due to the pandemic. However, globally, hospitals are running low. Additionally, other critical medical supplies such as saline and antibiotics are dwindling. Countries and companies are reportedly stockpiling supplies, disrupting healthcare supply chains, causing dangerous shortages in many parts of the world.
What you just witnessed were highlights from Event 201. This pandemic simulation exercise of the coronavirus took place about 6 weeks before the first illness from the coronavirus was actually reported in Wuhan, China. Now, this simulation also includes news reports, which were fabricated just for this exercise.
Are running low. Additionally, other critical medical supplies such as saline and antibiotics are dwindling. Countries and companies are reportedly stockpiling supplies, disrupting healthcare supply chains, causing dangerous shortages in many parts of the world.
What you just witnessed were highlights from Event 201. This pandemic simulation exercise of the coronavirus took place about 6 weeks before the first illness from the coronavirus was actually reported in Wuhan, China. Now, this simulation also includes news reports, which were fabricated just for this exercise.
A SARS-like virus, which has infected hundreds in China, has now reached the United States.
Some of the city's biggest employers ordering workers to stay home.
We have already started at the NIH and with many of our collaborators on the developing of a vaccine.
I wasn't necessarily surprised when we started to see him in the national limelight.
At the beginning of the pandemic, we really didn't know what it was going to be like and how to manage it and how infectious the virus was. And therefore, a lockdown made sense just to buy a little time to figure out what we should do, what policies we should make, what things needed to be mobilized in order to reduce risk of the infection and actually keep the epidemic as limited as possible.
In comes Tony Fauci, the savior of the West, promoting these actions, lockdowns, masking, etc.
I think many of my fellow Democrats see him as this kind of, particularly during the early COVID pandemic, as this kind of avuncular, soothing figure who was a reassuring counterbalance to Donald Trump's anti-science, narcissistic bombast.
See if there's any way that you can apply light and heat to cure. But I'm like a person that has a good you-know-what.
There was tremendous fear in our country that was orchestrated and generated by the press and by the medical cartel. When people get fearful, their capacity for critical thinking gets disabled, and it's just a human inclination to look for reassurance and leadership from leadership authorities.
He was one that we looked up to in a time where we needed answers, and a time he has a cool, calm, calmness to him, but very factual.
It's called the Fauci effect. I mean, it's nice, but in an era of the normalization of untruths and lies, it's what I symbolize. Consistency for integrity, for truth.
My impression from him, because I had already been dealing with him for 17 years, and I had a skepticism about him because I knew that he was the architect of agency capture within the public health agencies.
With the vaccine, as I use it, I say, help is on the way. It certainly is. But the fact that help is on the way should spur us even more to double down on some of the public health measures, the physical distancing, the universal wearing of masking, the staying away from crowds throughout the country.
But we all thought we were going to die, that this thing was going to sweep through and devastate all of us, which became weaponized for lockdowns. It became weaponized as a rationale for massive infusion of fiat currency into the economy, for causing people to no longer be able to go to work, et cetera, et cetera.
It became apparent after a while that the lockdowns are counterproductive.
And in many ways, COVID restrictions were worse than COVID itself. And so we kept getting news updates. Well, the swimming pool is now closed down. The gym is now closed down.
They use this fear to create the justifications for implementation of all these abrogations of personal liberties and civil rights. So it's just as shutting down businesses and causing them to get bankrupt.
Tech companies have benefited massively from pandemic policies that make no medical sense, such as lockdowns, such as not letting us shop in person, not letting us be educated in person, locking kids indoors. Amazon is up 20% net revenue in the last 2 years. Google is up 20 to 25% net revenue. Microsoft is up 20, 25% net revenue. Nintendo is up. All of them crafted or influenced lockdown policies that killed off human assembly, human commerce, human worship, human culture, and drove it all online.
But it may interest you to know, that all the most rigorous scientific studies have found that masks don't prevent transmission of respiratory viruses.
Masks have essentially no benefit. N95 was developed to protect construction workers from dust. Dust particles are removed by those 95% effectively. Dust particles are thousands of times larger than COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2, and it's like putting ping pong balls through a chain link fence. 95% of the time, they're just going to go straight through.
Dr. Fauci started out by saying correctly that masks don't do any good against respiratory viruses. He said it on 60 Minutes in I think it was March of 2020.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is.
And in saying that, for once, he was actually reflecting the scientific consensus, right? But then a couple months later, he completely flipped. The head of this Chinese CDC, George Gao, having said suddenly, everybody's got to wear a mask, right? Everybody in the West has got to wear a mask, as in China. Then Dr. Fauci shifted.
Masks are protective. If you look at children outside, particularly when they're with the family, walking down the street, playing a game or what have you, don't have to wear a mask.
The Academy of Pediatrics actually makes that recommendation that children should be wearing masks from 2 years old onward.
I mean, I think I've got this right. 1 mask is better than 0 masks. 2 masks is better than 1 mask. But you don't have to have double masks. Is that right? I mean...
Then a couple months later, the World Health Organization shifted because they too had said correctly that masks don't do anything against respiratory viruses. But then they flipped.
A dispute over a mask led to a woman being tased by a cop at a middle school game. Of course, no, it should have never come to this. What is your right to refuse, and what is law enforcement's ability to enforce?
You have to have a mask on.
Shoot me, people?
No.
You're gonna shoot me for trying not to breathe?
Cool.
Come
Cool.
on,
Come on.
dude.
And there is Barack Obama dancing unmasked. He's been talking about the need to get a vaccine and all the other stuff. I don't think he wants to break from the CDC. What's interesting is I haven't heard the CDC commenting about this yet.
Masks are pretty magical, and they don't have much downside.
People with masks, they give up their individuality, they give up rights as free human beings. You become really, it's the beginning of slavery. African American slaves in America, many of them, they wore masks. I have called the masks to be the symbolic equivalent